Hello and welcome. Tonight we journey to Renaissance Rome, to the glittering and deadly world of the papal court, where cardinals dined in fear, where every cup of wine might contain death, and where one Spanish family became synonymous with poison, treachery, and murder. We travel to the late 15th century to investigate one of history's most persistent legends. Were the Borgias really the master poisoners of reputation, or were they victims of history's most successful character assassination? But before we enter the halls of the Vatican, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's a simple and wonderful way to support this work, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world you are and what time it is as you're listening. So I'd really love to hear from you in the comments. And now, settle in. Let the modern world fade away. Let us journey to Rome in the year 1500, to a city of marble and murder, of art and assassination, of piety and poison. Let us meet the Borgias, the most infamous family in Renaissance history, and discover whether their reputation is earned or whether 5 centuries of legend have obscured a more complex truth. Imagine yourself at a banquet in the Vatican Palace on a warm evening in the summer of 1503. You're a cardinal, a prince of the church, dressed in scarlet robes that mark your rank, seated at a long table in one of the Vatican's great halls. The room is magnificent. Frescoed ceilings soar overhead, depicting biblical scenes in brilliant colours. Tapestries worth kingdoms hang on marble walls. Golden candlesticks, each taller than a man, illuminate the gathering with hundreds of flickering flames. The very air seems heavy with wealth, with power, with danger. The table before you is laden with magnificent food. Roasted peacock, displayed with its tail feathers spread. Whole lambs, suckling pigs, sides of venison. Pyramids of fruit, oranges from Sicily, grapes from Tuscany, pomegranates split open to reveal jewel-like seeds. Elaborate confections made with sugar and almonds, shaped into castles and coats of arms. Wine flows from silver pitchers into crystal goblets. The Pope himself presides over this feast. Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, sits at the head of the table. He's 69 years old, but still vital, still commanding. His face is sensual, intelligent, calculating. He wears white robes embroidered with gold thread, and on his finger glints the fisherman's ring that symbolizes his authority as Christ's vicar on earth. But everyone knows this pope is more concerned with earthly power than heavenly virtue. Near him sits his son, Cesare Borgia. The pope's son openly acknowledged despite the vows of celibacy that should have prevented his existence. Cesare is perhaps 28 years old, handsome in a cold way, with calculating eyes that miss nothing. He wears secular clothing, rich velvets and brocades, having recently resigned his position as cardinal to pursue military conquests. He's building a kingdom in central Italy through a combination of brilliant strategy and ruthless violence. People fear him. With good reason. Picture how you feel sitting at this table. You're honored to be here. A papal banquet is a sign of favor, an opportunity to advance your interests, to make connections that could lead to higher office. But you're also terrified, because you know the stories. Everyone knows the stories. Cardinals who dined at the Vatican and died within days, vomiting blood, their bodies swelling with poison. Wealthy Romans who offended the Borgias and perished mysteriously, their estates conveniently available for papal confiscation. Rivals who opposed Cesare's ambitions and fell ill with strange fevers from which they never recovered. Even family members, one of the Pope's nephews, allegedly poisoned when they became inconvenient or knew too much. And the whispered name for the Borgia weapon, La Cantarella. A secret poison, they say, developed by the Borgias themselves. Tasteless, colourless, quick-acting. Death in a cup of wine. Death in a plate of sweets. Death administered with a smile and a toast to your health. So you watch your wine cup constantly, never letting it out of your sight. You observe which dishes the Pope samples first, which wines he drinks from. You note which servants pour which cups, trying to detect any suspicious behavior, any unusual attention to particular guests. You eat sparingly, drink less. The food might be delicious, but you barely taste it. Fear has killed your appetite more effectively than any poison could. The conversation around you is witty, learned, touching on matters of art and politics and theology. Music plays from a gallery above lutes and viols, and a voice singing a madrigal. The Pope laughs at someone's joke, his voice booming across the hall. Cesare watches everyone with those cold eyes, occasionally murmuring something to his father. And you wonder, will I leave this banquet alive? Will tomorrow find me in my own bed? Or will I be the next victim of the legendary Borgia poison? Is this magnificent feast my last supper? This is the atmosphere that surrounds the Borgias. This is the fear they inspire. This is the legend that will outlive them by 5 centuries. But is the legend true? That's what we've come to discover. To understand the Borgias, we must first understand the Rome they ruled. Because this isn't the Rome of Caesar and gladiators, nor the Rome of modern tourism. This is Renaissance Rome in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, a city suspended between medieval chaos and classical rebirth, where Christian piety and pagan sensuality coexisted uneasily, where art flourished alongside assassination. Imagine arriving in Rome. Picture the city as it appears to a visitor arriving in the year 1492, the year Rodrigo Borgia becomes Pope Alexander VI. The city is smaller than ancient Rome, much smaller. The vast urban sprawl that once housed 1 million people has contracted to perhaps 40 or 50,000 inhabitants clustered near the Tiber River. Entire districts lie abandoned, their ruins providing building materials for new construction, their open spaces given over to vineyards and gardens and grazing livestock. But what Rome lacks in size, it makes up for in magnificence and menace. The great monuments of antiquity still stand, though often damaged or repurposed. The Colosseum is there, though families have built fortresses into its structure and use it as a quarry for marble and travertine. The Pantheon survives, converted to a church, its pagan origins Christianized but not erased. Triumphal arches, broken aqueducts, collapsed temples everywhere ancient Rome intrudes into the present, reminding residents of former greatness while testifying to centuries of decline. The medieval city built atop these ruins is a maze of narrow streets, barely wide enough for 2 horses to pass. Houses crowd together, often connected by overhead passages, blocking out sunlight even at midday. The streets are unpaved, muddy in rain, dusty in heat, always full of refuse because there's no organized sanitation system. Pigs root in the streets, serving as primitive garbage disposal. The smell is overwhelming human waste, animal waste, rotting food, the Tiber River itself, which serves as both water source and sewer. Violence is endemic. Noble families fortify their palaces into private fortresses, maintaining private armies that battle each other in the streets over ancient feuds and current insults. The Colonna family, the Orsini family, the Savelli, these great Roman clans have fought each other for generations, turning the city into a battleground where murder is commonplace and law is whatever the strongest family can enforce. Imagine walking through Rome's streets in the evening. You don't go alone, that would be suicidal. You travel in a group, armed, alert for danger. The streets are dark. There's no public lighting, just occasional lamps in windows or torches carried by travelers. Shadows hide doorways where bandits might wait. Alleys offer perfect ambush spots. You listen for footsteps, for voices, for the telltale sounds of men moving stealthily toward you. And you're not just worried about common thieves. The noble families employ bravos, hired assassins, who will kill anyone for a price. Political enemies, romantic rivals, inconvenient witnesses, all can be eliminated for a few gold coins. Justice is almost non-existent. The weak papal government can barely maintain order, even in the districts surrounding the Vatican. Most murders go unpunished. Most killers walk free, protected by their employers' wealth and power. Imagine entering the Vatican Palace. Picture it as it exists in the Borgia era. St. Peter's Basilica is still the old medieval structure, not the magnificent Renaissance cathedral we know today. That will come later, built partly with money raised through the sale of indulgences, the very practice that will trigger the Protestant Reformation. The Vatican Palace is a sprawling complex of buildings and courtyards, a city within the city, housing the Pope, his household, the College of Cardinals, and the vast bureaucracy that administers the Catholic Church. This is the centre of Christendom. From here, the Pope claims authority over every Christian soul in Europe. Kings and emperors theoretically bow to papal authority. Bishops and archbishops owe their positions to papal appointment. The vast wealth of the church tithes collected from every parish, income from church lands across Europe, fees for dispensations and appointments flows to Rome. But this spiritual centre is also breathtakingly corrupt. The papacy itself has become a prize fought over by great Italian families, the Medici, the Della Rovere, the Borgia. Cardinals sell their votes in papal elections to the highest bidder. Church offices are bought and sold like commercial commodities. Bishops who never visit their diocese collect incomes from multiple appointments simultaneously. Priests maintain mistresses and father children despite vows of celibacy. The scandals are not secret, everyone knows. No one seems to care. The cardinals themselves live like princes. They maintain palaces, patronize artists, collect classical manuscripts, host elaborate banquets. Many are younger sons of noble families who entered the church not from vocation but because it offered power and wealth. Some are learned and pious. Many are neither. They scheme against each other, form factions, pursue family interests while wearing ecclesiastical robes. And, presiding over this spectacular corruption, are the Renaissance popes. These aren't necessarily holy men, they're politicians, generals, patrons of art, fathers of illegitimate children, collectors of mistresses and wealth and power. They wage wars, make alliances, assassinate rivals, all while claiming to represent Christ on earth. The contradiction seems not to trouble them or their contemporaries. This is simply how power works in Renaissance Italy. Into this world comes the Borgia family. Spanish in origin, ambitious beyond measure, willing to use any means, bribery, nepotism, warfare, and yes, possibly poison to achieve their goals. They don't create the corruption of Renaissance Rome, they simply master it more effectively than their rivals. And in doing so, they become the symbol of everything wrong with the Renaissance papacy. But were they really worse than their contemporaries? Or simply more successful and therefore more hated? That's one of the questions we must answer as we investigate the legend of Borgia poison. Rome, in the late 15th century, was a paradox. A city of incomparable artistic achievement and shocking moral corruption, a place where the highest ideals of Christianity coexisted with the most cynical political brutality. To understand the Borgias and the accusations against them, we must first understand this world, its power structures, its violence, its casual relationship with death. The Rome of 1470 to 1520, the period of Borgia dominance, was not the Rome of the ancient emperors, though their ruins still dotted the landscape. It was not yet the Rome of Baroque splendor that would emerge after the Catholic Counter-Reformation. It was a medieval city in transition, beginning to transform under the influence of the Renaissance, but still fundamentally organized around the power of the Pope and the Church. The city's population fluctuated between 40,000 and 50,000 people, making it one of the larger European cities, but far smaller than its ancient peak. The people lived crowded into a small area along the Tiber River and in the district around the Vatican. Much of the ancient city lay abandoned, the great forums overgrown with vegetation, ancient buildings serving as quarries for new construction, cattle grazing among fallen columns. The climate was harsh in ways modern visitors to Rome might not expect. Summer brought intense heat and, more dangerously, malaria. The disease, spread by mosquitoes breeding in the marshy areas around the Tiber, killed thousands every year. Popes and cardinals fled to summer residences in the hills to escape the bad air, the mala aria, that gave the disease its name. Those who remained in the city during summer months risked death. This epidemic disease is crucial to understanding the accusations of poisoning, as we shall see. The physical center of power was the Vatican, a complex of buildings on the west bank of the Tiber. The Vatican was not yet the unified architectural masterpiece we know today. St. Peter's Basilica was still the old Constantine-era church, not the grand Renaissance structure designed by Bramante, Michelangelo, and others. The Sistine Chapel had just been completed in 1481, its ceiling still unpainted. Michelangelo would not begin his famous frescoes until 1508. The papal palace was a warren of buildings constructed and modified by successive popes, each adding apartments, chapels, and administrative offices according to his needs and tastes. The rooms were decorated with frescoes by the finest artists. Pinturicchio created magnificent paintings for Alexander VI's apartments, depicting mythological and religious scenes with a sensuality that shocked more austere critics. These apartments were the setting for the most important political decisions in Christendom. Here, the Pope received ambassadors from every European power. Here, he appointed cardinals, negotiated treaties, decided questions of war and peace. Here, he lived with a luxury that contradicted every principle of Christian humility and poverty. For the Pope in the Renaissance was not primarily a spiritual leader. He was a temporal prince, ruler of the Papal States, a band of territories across central Italy that the Church had accumulated over centuries. These territories provided income, military power, and political importance. A weak pope meant the Papal States were vulnerable to invasion by Venice, Milan, Florence, Naples, or France. A strong pope could be a major player in the endless wars among Italian states. The pope's power within the Church was theoretically absolute. He appointed cardinals, the princes of the Church who would elect his successor. He granted bishoprics and other lucrative church offices. He collected taxes from churches across Europe. He sold indulgences, documents forgiving sins that brought enormous revenue. The wealth flowing into Rome from all of Christendom was staggering, and much of it ended up in the personal coffers of popes and cardinals. This wealth attracted ambitious men from across Europe. The College of Cardinals was supposed to be a council of the Church's wisest and holiest leaders. In reality, it was often a collection of the younger sons of Europe's great families, men who saw the Church as a career path to wealth and power rather than a spiritual calling. Cardinals lived like princes, maintaining palaces, servants, mistresses, and private armies. Some were learned and pious. Others were corrupt, dissolute, and interested only in accumulating benefices, church positions that provided income. The papal court was elaborate, governed by Byzantine rituals and protocols. The Pope was surrounded by officials with arcane titles. The Cardinal Camerlengo managed church finances, the Vice-Chancellor headed the papal bureaucracy, the Grand Penitentiary heard confessions of serious sins. There were scores of lesser offices, all providing income to their holders, all objects of competition and intrigue. Nepotism was not just accepted but expected. Every pope appointed his relatives to important positions. This was seen as necessary. A pope needed people he could trust, and blood ties provided the strongest bond. The word nepotism itself comes from the Italian nipote, meaning nephew, reflecting the practice of popes appointing their nephews, and sometimes their illegitimate sons, euphemistically called nephews, to cardinalships and other high offices. Violence was endemic in Renaissance Rome, and not just at the highest levels of power. The streets were dangerous. Armed gangs employed by various cardinals and nobles fought for control of neighborhoods. Robbery and murder were common. The Tiber regularly yielded bodies, victims of violence dumped in the river. The papal authorities maintained order only sporadically. Powerful men could literally get away with murder if they had the right connections. Political assassination was a normal tool of statecraft. If someone was an obstacle to your ambitions, you removed them. This could be done openly: a hired assassin, a suspicious accident, a violent quarrel that ended in death, or covertly, through methods that left no clear evidence. Poison was one such method, though, as we shall see, less common than legend suggests. Rome was also a city of stunning artistic achievement. This was the High Renaissance, the age of Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Bramante. The popes and cardinals, for all their corruption, were magnificent patrons of art and architecture. They commissioned paintings, sculptures, and buildings that remain masterpieces 5 centuries later. Rodrigo Borgia himself, for all his faults, was a generous patron who employed some of the finest artists of his age. The city hummed with intellectual energy. Humanist scholars studied classical texts, debated philosophy, wrote poetry in Latin, imitating ancient models. The printing press, recently invented, was producing books at unprecedented rates. The University of Rome attracted students from across Europe. Libraries were being assembled, manuscripts collected and copied. This was a golden age of learning, even as it was an age of political brutality. The contrast was stark and troubling. How could the same men who commissioned sublime religious art and supported classical learning also engage in bribery, violence, and moral corruption? How could popes who were meant to be Christ's representatives on earth father illegitimate children, wage war, and accumulate vast personal fortunes? The answer lies in understanding that Renaissance people did not see the same contradictions we do. Religion was not about personal virtue, but about maintaining proper forms and supporting the church as an institution. A man could be genuinely pious, attend Mass daily, fund chapels, endow monasteries, while also keeping mistresses, murdering rivals, and enriching his family through corrupt means. These were seen as different spheres of life, not incompatible with each other. Moreover, power was its own justification. In an age before modern democracy or human rights, the strong did what they would, and the weak suffered what they must. This was the natural order. A pope who successfully advanced his family, who made his relatives wealthy and powerful, who expanded the church's territories, this was a successful pope, fulfilling the proper role of his office. That he might have achieved this through bribery, nepotism, or violence was less important than the results. Into this world, brilliant, corrupt, violent, magnificent, came the Borgias, a Spanish family from Valencia, who would rise to control the papacy itself, accumulate vast wealth and power, make deadly enemies, and acquire a reputation for evil that would echo through the centuries. They were not, as we shall see, significantly worse than many of their contemporaries. They were simply more successful, more foreign, and ultimately more hated. Their story is inseparable from the world that created them. The accusations of poisoning that would dog their reputation make sense only in the context of Renaissance Rome, where death was common, disease was epidemic, medicine was primitive, and suspicion flourished in an atmosphere of constant intrigue. To understand whether the Borgias were really poisoners, we must first understand the world in which such accusations could seem plausible, even probable, where every death could be interpreted as murder, and every misfortune attributed to malice rather than chance. The Borgias were not Italians. This simple fact is crucial to understanding their story and the hatred they inspired. They were Spaniards from the Kingdom of Valencia in eastern Spain, and in Renaissance Italy, being Spanish made them automatically suspect, automatically other, automatically targets for resentment and prejudice. The family name was originally Borgia in Spanish, later Italianized to Borgia. They were minor nobility in Valencia, respectable but not particularly distinguished. The family's rise to prominence began with Alphonse de Borja, born in 1378 near Valencia. Alphonse was intelligent and ambitious, and he chose the church as his path to advancement, a common strategy for younger sons of noble families. Alphonse de Borgia studied law at the University of Lleida, where he proved exceptionally capable. His legal skills brought him to the attention of the kings of Aragon, and he served in various administrative and diplomatic positions. His great opportunity came during the Council of Basel, a gathering of church officials in the 1430s that dealt with questions of church governance and reform. Alphonse distinguished himself through his diplomatic skill and his loyalty to the papacy against those who wanted to limit papal power. Pope Eugenius IV, grateful for Alphonse's support, elevated him to cardinal in 1444. From there, Alphonse continued his rise. In 1455, at age 77, he was elected pope, taking the name Calixtus III. His papacy lasted only 3 years. He died in 1458, but it established the Borgia presence in Rome. Calixtus practiced shameless nepotism, appointing 2 of his nephews as cardinals. One of these nephews was Rodrigo Borgia, born in 1431 near Valencia, who would become the most famous or infamous member of the family. Rodrigo Borgia was appointed cardinal at age 25 through his uncle's influence. He was young, handsome, intelligent, and utterly charming. He was also ambitious beyond measure and untroubled by the vows of celibacy that were supposed to govern clergy. From his youth, Rodrigo maintained relationships with women, fathering numerous illegitimate children whom he openly acknowledged and advanced. When Calixtus died in 1458, Rodrigo was too young and too Spanish to be elected pope. Instead, he focused on building his power within the church. He was appointed vice-chancellor, the second most powerful position in the papal administration, by Pope Pius II. He held this position for over 30 years, through the reigns of multiple popes, accumulating wealth, influence, and an extensive network of clients and allies. Rodrigo's personal life was scandalous, even by the relaxed standards of Renaissance Rome. His long-term mistress was Vanozza dei Catanei, a Roman woman from a respectable family. With Vanozza, Rodrigo had at least 4 children: Cesare, Juan, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey, spelled variously. The Italian forms were Cesare, Giovanni, Lucrezia, and Geoffrey. These children were acknowledged, educated, and prepared for important roles, though of course they could not inherit their father's cardinalate or other church offices. In 1492, when Pope Innocent VIII died, Rodrigo saw his opportunity. He was 61 years old, wealthy, experienced, and determined to reach the papacy. What followed was one of the most notoriously corrupt papal elections in history. The conclave that gathered to elect the new pope consisted of 23 cardinals. Rodrigo needed 2/3 of their votes. He obtained them through systematic bribery. He promised offices, benefices, lands, and cash payments to cardinals who would vote for him. He made separate deals with different cardinals, offering each what they most desired. The Venetian ambassador reported that 4 mule loads of silver were sent to various cardinals' palaces on the night before the election. The election was not even close. Rodrigo was elected on the second ballot, taking the name Alexander VI. His choice of name was significant. He took it from Alexander the Great, signaling his grand ambitions. He would not be a modest, pious pope focused on spiritual matters. He would be a political pope, a warrior pope, a pope who would restore and expand the power of the papacy. Alexander VI was 61 when he became pope, but he seemed younger, vigorous, and energetic. He was tall, with a commanding presence, eloquent, quick-witted, and capable of great charm when it served his purposes. He was also utterly cynical about religion, treating the papacy as a political office rather than a spiritual one. His goal was simple: to make the Borgia family great, to establish them as one of Europe's permanent powers. This meant advancing his children. And here we must confront an uncomfortable fact. Pope Alexander VI openly loved and promoted his illegitimate children in ways that shocked even Renaissance Rome. He did not hide them or pretend they didn't exist. He brought them to the Vatican, gave them apartments, included them in ceremonies. This was not just nepotism. Every pope practiced nepotism. This was something more brazen, a pope acting like a secular prince building a dynasty rather than a spiritual leader shepherding souls. Of his children, 4 would play significant roles in the drama to come. Cesare Borgia, born 1475 or 1476, was the second son but the most capable. He was handsome, intelligent, absolutely ruthless, and possessed of extraordinary ambition. His father made him a cardinal at age 18, but Cesare chafed at the church career imposed on him. He wanted to be a secular prince, a military commander, a ruler of territories. He would eventually get his wish, with consequences we shall explore. Juan Borgia, born 1476, possibly Cesare's twin, though records are unclear, was the eldest legitimate son and his father's favourite. Juan was made Duke of Gandia, married to a Spanish princess, and groomed for military command. He was handsome, charming, and apparently none too bright. His relationship with his brother Cesare would end tragically, as we shall see. Lucrezia Borgia, born 1480, was the only daughter from Alexander's relationship with Vanozza. She would become the most slandered woman of the Renaissance, accused of incest, murder by poison, and every other crime imaginable. The reality, as we shall examine, was very different from the legend. Joffre Borgia, born 1481 or 1482, was the youngest, less capable than his siblings, and used primarily as a pawn in his father's diplomatic schemes. After becoming pope, Alexander also took a new mistress, Julia Farnese, a beautiful young woman from a prominent Roman family. Julia was married, but her husband conveniently accepted the situation in exchange for the honours and wealth that came with being cuckold to the Pope. Julia bore Alexander at least one child, though the exact number is debated. Romans, showing their characteristic wit, called her Julia la Bella, Julia the Beautiful, and also the Pope's whore, though the latter was said more quietly. This, then, was the Borgia family as Alexander's papacy began, a Spanish pope who had purchased his office, openly maintaining mistresses and promoting illegitimate children, surrounded by ambitious offspring who would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. They were resented for their foreignness, their Spanish origins, their shameless nepotism, and their success. They made enemies among the great Roman families who had long dominated the papacy and who saw these Spanish upstarts as interlopers. These enemies, the Orsini, the Colonna, the Della Rovera, and others, would wage a propaganda war against the Borgias that lasted decades and continued long after the family's fall from power. It is from these enemies that many of the worst accusations against the Borgias originate. The poisoning legend, the tales of incest, the descriptions of orgies in the Vatican, much of this comes from hostile sources, with every reason to blacken the Borgia name. This does not mean the Borgias were innocent. They were not. They committed real crimes, engaged in real violence, destroyed real lives in their pursuit of power. But separating their actual crimes from their legendary ones, distinguishing what they really did from what their enemies accused them of doing, is the challenge we face in investigating whether they were truly the master poisoners of reputation. Before we can examine specific poisoning accusations, we must understand what poisons were available in Renaissance Italy, how they worked, how they were detected or not detected, and why poisoning became such a powerful element in political intrigue and public imagination. Poison, in the Renaissance, held a unique place in the arsenal of violence. Unlike a sword or dagger, poison offered distance. The killer need not be present when the victim died. Unlike an ambush or assassination, poison offered deniability. Death could appear natural, the work of disease rather than malice. And unlike open warfare, poison offered discretion. A target could be eliminated without scandal, without public knowledge, without consequences for the killer if done skillfully. These qualities made poison particularly attractive in the Renaissance, where reputation mattered immensely, where being accused of murder could damage one's standing even if murder itself was common, and where the appearance of propriety had to be maintained even while engaging in the most ruthless behavior. Poison was, in this sense, the perfect weapon for a world of elaborate courtesy concealing deadly rivalry. But we must understand what poison meant in the Renaissance and how different it was from modern toxic substances. The poisons available to a Renaissance poisoner were limited by the chemistry of the age. There was no cyanide, no strychnine, no modern synthetic compounds. What existed were naturally occurring substances, minerals, plant extracts, animal venoms whose effects had been known since ancient times. Arsenic was perhaps the most common poison. Arsenic trioxide, a white powder, was relatively easy to obtain. It was used in glassmaking, in tanning leather, and in various industrial processes. In large doses, it caused violent illness, vomiting, abdominal pain, diarrhea, followed by death within hours or days. In smaller, repeated doses, it could cause a chronic illness resembling wasting disease, with the victim slowly declining over weeks or months before dying of what appeared to be natural causes. Arsenic's great advantage was that it was tasteless and odorless, easily mixed into food or wine. Its disadvantage was that it often produced distinctive symptoms: the violent gastrointestinal distress, the burning sensation in the throat and stomach that experienced physicians might recognize as poisoning. Moreover, arsenic had a cumulative effect, building up in the body's tissues, particularly in hair and nails, where modern forensic science can detect it centuries later. Antimony compounds were another option. Antimony salts could induce vomiting and purging so violent that victims died of dehydration and shock. In controlled doses, antimony was actually used as a medicine. Doctors prescribed it to purge the body of illness. This medical use provided perfect cover for poisoning. A murderer could claim they were merely administering medicine, and, if the patient died, well, sometimes medical treatment failed. Mercury compounds, particularly mercuric chloride, were extremely toxic. Mercury poisoning caused salivation, tremors, kidney damage, and eventually death. But mercury poisoning produced distinctive symptoms that were difficult to disguise as natural disease, and mercury was not easily concealed in food or drink. It had a metallic taste that alert victims might detect. Aconite, derived from the monkshood plant, was a powerful poison that affected the heart and nervous system. Even small doses could kill, causing paralysis, cardiac arrhythmia, and death. But aconite was less commonly used than the mineral poisons because it was more difficult to obtain. The plant had to be cultivated or gathered from the wild, and because its effects were somewhat unpredictable. Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, was another plant poison, containing tropane alkaloids that caused hallucinations, rapid heart rate, seizures, and death. But belladonna's effects were so dramatic and distinctive that they were unlikely to be mistaken for natural illness. A victim of belladonna poisoning would display obviously abnormal symptoms: dilated pupils, delirium, violent behavior that would immediately raise suspicion. There were other substances as well: various mushrooms, animal venoms, toxic plants from across Europe and the Mediterranean. Books existed detailing these poisons and their effects. Classical texts like Dioscorides' De Materia Medica from the 1st century AD, medieval Arabic medical texts, and contemporary Renaissance compilations of toxicological knowledge. But here is the crucial point. None of these poisons was perfect for secret murder. All of them had drawbacks. Arsenic, the closest to an ideal poison, still produced symptoms that could be recognized. The others were either too dramatic in their effects, too difficult to administer, or too unpredictable in their lethality. Moreover, Renaissance medicine had ways of treating poisoning, though these treatments were often as dangerous as the poisons themselves. Emetics to induce vomiting, purges to clear the bowels, bloodletting to remove poisoned blood, various herbal remedies supposed to neutralize toxins. These were standard responses to suspected poisoning. Whether they actually helped is questionable, but they were widely employed. Now, about the legendary Borgia poison Cantarella. Supposedly this was a secret formula, a white powder that could be mixed into wine or food, that produced symptoms indistinguishable from natural disease, and that killed with certainty. The recipe was supposedly known only to the Borgias, passed from father to son, never written down, the perfect murder weapon. The problem with this legend is simple. No such poison existed, or more precisely, no evidence exists that the Borgias possessed any poison significantly different from those available to anyone else. The descriptions of Cantarella in contemporary sources are vague and contradictory. Some say it was arsenic mixed with phosphorus from decomposed bodies. Others claim it was derived from a pig fed on poisonous plants and then killed, with some organ, kidney, liver, spleen, providing the toxic substance. Still others describe it as a powder derived from dried toads or other animals. These recipes are almost certainly fabrications, post facto attempts to explain Borgia power by attributing to them supernatural or special knowledge. The name Cantarella itself is suspicious. It means little song or little singer in Italian, which makes no sense as a poison name. Some scholars suggest it was a corruption of Cantarella, a type of blister beetle whose dried body contains cantharidin, a genuine poison. But there's no reliable evidence the Borgias used this or any other specific substance consistently. What seems more likely is that if the Borgias poisoned anyone, and as we shall see, this is questionable, they used arsenic, the same poison available to any would-be murderer of the age. The elaborate legend of Cantarella developed later, as part of the mythology surrounding the family. Detection of poisoning in the Renaissance was primitive at best. There was no forensic toxicology, no chemical analysis, no way to definitively prove that someone had been poisoned rather than dying of disease. Physicians could observe symptoms and sometimes conclude that poison was likely, but this was educated guesswork, not scientific proof. Food tasters were employed by people wealthy enough to afford them. These unfortunate individuals would sample food and drink before their masters consumed it, theoretically detecting poison by falling ill or dying themselves. But food tasters provided only limited protection. A slow-acting poison might not affect the taster during the brief period before the master ate, and a clever poisoner could bribe or threaten the taster, turning them from protection into accomplice. Autopsies were rarely performed in the Renaissance, and when they were, they revealed little. Without understanding of germ theory or toxicology, Renaissance physicians examining a corpse could identify obvious injuries, but could not distinguish poisoning from disease. A body showing signs of gastrointestinal distress might have died from poison, from food poisoning, from dysentery, from cholera, or from numerous other causes. There was no way to tell. This lack of diagnostic ability is crucial to understanding the poisoning accusations against the Borgias. In a world where disease killed constantly and mysteriously, where medicine could not explain most deaths, where suspicion flourished in an atmosphere of intrigue and fear, any death could be attributed to poison if there was motive to do so. A cardinal who had opposed the Pope dies suddenly, poisoned. A nobleman who owes money to the church dies leaving a large estate, poisoned. A political rival disappears from the scene, poisoned. Whether these deaths were actually caused by poison or by the 1,000 natural shocks that flesh is heir to disease, accident, medical incompetence was impossible to determine. And in the absence of proof, people believed what fit their assumptions. If you thought the Borgias were evil, every convenient death confirmed your suspicions. If you benefited from blaming the Borgias, every mysterious illness became evidence of their guilt. This brings us to the most important fact about Renaissance poisoning accusations. They were often political weapons rather than statements of fact. Accusing someone of poisoning was a way to destroy their reputation, to undermine their authority, to provide an explanation for events that otherwise seemed like bad luck or divine judgment. The Borgias' enemies, and they had many enemies, used poisoning accusations systematically. Every death that benefited the Borgias was attributed to their malice. Every cardinal who died and left his wealth to the church was supposedly poisoned. every rival who fell ill was supposedly a victim of Borgia treachery. These accusations spread through letters, pamphlets, gossip, and diplomatic reports, creating a narrative of Borgia evil that persisted long after the family's fall. Were some of these accusations true? Possibly. The Borgias were capable of murder, certainly. But were they systematic poisoners, using a secret formula to kill dozens or hundreds of enemies? The evidence, as we shall see when we examine specific cases, suggests otherwise. Before we turn to those specific cases, we must understand one more crucial element of the story: the role of disease, particularly malaria, in Renaissance Rome. Because malaria, not poison, may have killed most of the people the Borgias were accused of murdering. Rome in summer was a death trap. From June through September, when heat and humidity peaked, malaria swept through the city with predictable regularity. Thousands died. The wealthy fled to villas in the hills. Those who remained the poor, the unlucky, those with business that couldn't wait risked their lives. Malaria deserves special attention because it killed so many people in Renaissance Rome, including, as we'll see, possibly Pope Alexander VI himself. The disease was endemic in central Italy, particularly in the summer months when mosquitoes bred prolifically in the marshy areas around Rome and in the Pontine marshes to the south. Picture what malaria does to the body. The disease is caused by a parasite transmitted through mosquito bites. Though Renaissance Romans didn't understand this mechanism, they believed malaria came from bad air, malaria in Italian, rising from swamps, which is why they called it that. They were wrong about the cause, but right that proximity to marshy areas increased risk. The symptoms begin with fever, high fever, often reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The victim sweats profusely, soaking through clothes and bedding. Then the fever breaks, the victim feels briefly better, and everyone hopes recovery is beginning. But the fever returns, cycling every 2 or 3 days, each cycle weakening the victim further. As the disease progresses, the victim develops anemia. The parasites destroy red blood cells, leaving the person pale, weak, unable to function. The spleen swells enormously, sometimes rupturing and causing death through internal bleeding. Jaundice might develop as the liver fails. If the parasite enters the brain, cerebral malaria, the victim might experience seizures, fall into a coma, and die within days. Many malaria victims recovered, especially after repeated infections built up some immunity, but some died, particularly if they were already weakened by age or other illnesses. And the symptoms, fever, sweating, organ damage, eventual death, could easily be mistaken for poisoning by anyone predisposed to see conspiracy rather than disease. Malaria was not understood in the Renaissance. The disease, caused by parasites transmitted by mosquitoes, would not be identified until the late 19th century. Renaissance people knew only that summer in Rome was unhealthy, that breathing the bad air, the malaria, could strike you down with fever, chills, and delirium. They didn't know that the real culprits were mosquitoes breeding in the marshes along the Tiber and in the standing water that collected in ruins and abandoned areas throughout the city. Malaria deserves special attention because it killed so many people in Renaissance Rome, including, as we'll see, possibly Pope Alexander VI himself. The disease was endemic in central Italy, particularly in the summer months when mosquitoes bred prolifically in the marshy areas around Rome and in the Pontine marshes to the south. Picture what malaria does to the body. The disease is caused by a parasite transmitted through mosquito bites. Though Renaissance Romans didn't understand this mechanism, they believed malaria came from bad air, malaria in Italian, rising from swamps, which is why they called it that. They were wrong about the cause, but right that proximity to marshy areas increased risk. The symptoms begin with fever, high fever, often reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The victim sweats profusely, soaking through clothes and bedding. Then the fever breaks. The victim feels briefly better, and everyone hopes recovery is beginning. But the fever returns, cycling every 2 or 3 days, each cycle weakening the victim further. As the disease progresses, the victim develops anemia. The parasites destroy red blood cells, leaving the person pale, weak, unable to function. The spleen swells enormously, sometimes rupturing and causing death through internal bleeding. Jaundice might develop as the liver fails. If the parasite enters the brain, cerebral malaria, the victim might experience seizures, fall into a coma, and die within days. Many malaria victims recovered, especially after repeated infections built up some immunity. But some died, particularly if they were already weakened by age or other illnesses. And the symptoms, fever, sweating, organ damage, eventual death, could easily be mistaken for poisoning by anyone predisposed to see conspiracy rather than disease. The symptoms of malaria could easily be mistaken for poisoning, and vice versa. Both could cause fever, sweating, chills, vomiting, weakness, and delirium. Both could kill within days or weeks. Both could affect multiple people at the same gathering if they were all exposed to infected mosquitoes at the same location. A cardinal who attended a dinner at the Vatican and died of fever 3 days later, was he poisoned at that dinner? Or did he contract malaria while traveling to the Vatican through the mosquito-infested areas near the river? Malaria deserves special attention because it killed so many people in Renaissance Rome, including, as we'll see, possibly Pope Alexander VI himself. The disease was endemic in central Italy, particularly in the summer months when mosquitoes bred prolifically in the marshy areas around Rome and in the Pontine marshes to the south. Picture what malaria does to the body. The disease is caused by a parasite transmitted through mosquito bites. Though Renaissance Romans didn't understand this mechanism, they believed malaria came from bad air, mal aria in Italian, rising from swamps, which is why they called it that. They were wrong about the cause, but right that proximity to marshy areas increased risk. The symptoms begin with fever, high fever, often reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The victim sweats profusely, soaking through clothes and bedding. Then, the fever breaks, the victim feels briefly better, and everyone hopes recovery is beginning. But the fever returns, cycling every 2 or 3 days, each cycle weakening the victim further. As the disease progresses, the victim develops anemia. The parasites destroy red blood cells, leaving the person pale, weak, unable to function. The spleen swells enormously, sometimes rupturing and causing death through internal bleeding. Jaundice might develop as the liver fails. If the parasite enters the brain, cerebral malaria, the victim might experience seizures, fall into a coma, and die within days. Many malaria victims recovered, especially after repeated infections built up some immunity. But some died, particularly if they were already weakened by age or other illnesses. And the symptoms, fever, sweating, organ damage, eventual death, could easily be mistaken for poisoning by anyone predisposed to see conspiracy rather than disease. Renaissance physicians had no way to tell. They observed symptoms, applied their theories of humoral medicine, the belief that illness resulted from imbalances in the body's 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and prescribed treatments that were largely ineffective. Bloodletting, purging, various herbal remedies, none of these addressed the actual cause of malaria or poisoning, though they might coincidentally help or harm depending on the patient's condition. Malaria deserves special attention because it killed so many people in Renaissance Rome, including, as we'll see, possibly Pope Alexander VI himself. The disease was endemic in central Italy, particularly in the summer months when mosquitoes bred prolifically in the marshy areas around Rome and in the Pontine marshes to the south. Picture what malaria does to the body. The disease is caused by a parasite transmitted through mosquito bites, though Renaissance Romans didn't understand this mechanism. They believed malaria came from bad air, mal aria in Italian, rising from swamps, which is why they called it that. They were wrong about the cause, but right that proximity to marshy areas increased risk. The symptoms begin with fever, high fever, often reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The victim sweats profusely, soaking through clothes and bedding. Then the fever breaks. The victim feels briefly better, and everyone hopes recovery is beginning, but the fever returns, cycling every 2 or 3 days, each cycle weakening the victim further. As the disease progresses, the victim develops anemia. The parasites destroy red blood cells, leaving the person pale, weak, unable to function. The spleen swells enormously, sometimes rupturing and causing death through internal bleeding. Jaundice might develop as the liver fails. If the parasite enters the brain, cerebral malaria, the victim might experience seizures, fall into a coma, and die within days. Many malaria victims recovered, especially after repeated infections built up some immunity. But some died, particularly if they were already weakened by age or other illnesses. And the symptoms, fever, sweating, organ damage, eventual death, could easily be mistaken for poisoning by anyone predisposed to see conspiracy rather than disease. The mortality rate from malaria in Rome was staggering. During bad years, perhaps 10% of the city's population died in the summer months. Cardinals and other wealthy individuals were not immune. Their fine clothes and luxurious residences offered no protection against mosquitoes. In fact, the Vatican's location near the Tiber made it particularly vulnerable. Malaria deserves special attention because it killed so many people in Renaissance Rome, including, as we'll see, possibly Pope Alexander VI himself. The disease was endemic in central Italy, particularly in the summer months when mosquitoes bred prolifically in the marshy areas around Rome and in the Pontine marshes to the south. Picture what malaria does to the body. The disease is caused by a parasite transmitted through mosquito bites, though Renaissance Romans didn't understand this mechanism. They believed malaria came from bad air, malaria in Italian, rising from swamps, which is why they called it that. They were wrong about the cause, but right that proximity to marshy areas increased risk. The symptoms begin with fever, high fever, often reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The victim sweats profusely, soaking through clothes and bedding. Then the fever breaks. The victim feels briefly better, and everyone hopes recovery is beginning. But the fever returns, cycling every 2 or 3 days, each cycle weakening the victim further. As the disease progresses, the victim develops anemia. The parasites destroy red blood cells, leaving the person pale, weak, unable to function. The spleen swells enormously, sometimes rupturing and causing death through internal bleeding. Jaundice might develop as the liver fails. If the parasite enters the brain, cerebral malaria, the victim might experience seizures, fall into a coma, and die within days. Many malaria victims recovered, especially after repeated infections built up some immunity. But some died, particularly if they were already weakened by age or other illnesses. And the symptoms, fever, sweating, organ damage, eventual death, could easily be mistaken for poisoning by anyone predisposed to see conspiracy rather than disease. This epidemic disease provides an alternative explanation for many of the deaths attributed to Borgia poisoning. Consider the pattern. Most alleged Borgia victims died in summer months after attending functions at the Vatican. This could indicate they were poisoned at these functions, or it could indicate they contracted malaria while traveling to or from the Vatican, or while attending outdoor ceremonies in the Vatican gardens where mosquitoes were thick. Malaria deserves special attention because it killed so many people in Renaissance Rome, including, as we'll see, possibly Pope Alexander VI himself. The disease was endemic in central Italy, particularly in the summer months when mosquitoes bred prolifically in the marshy areas around Rome and in the Pontine marshes to the south. Picture what malaria does to the body. The disease is caused by a parasite transmitted through mosquito bites, though Renaissance Romans didn't understand this mechanism. They believed malaria came from bad air, malaria in Italian, rising from swamps, which is why they called it that. They were wrong about the cause, but right that proximity to marshy areas increased risk. The symptoms begin with fever, high fever, often reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The victim sweats profusely, soaking through clothes and bedding. Then the fever breaks, the victim feels briefly better, and everyone hopes recovery is beginning. But the fever returns, cycling every 2 or 3 days, each cycle weakening the victim further. As the disease progresses, the victim develops anemia. The parasites destroy red blood cells, leaving the person pale, weak, unable to function. The spleen swells enormously, sometimes rupturing and causing death through internal bleeding. Jaundice might develop as the liver fails. If the parasite enters the brain, cerebral malaria, the victim might experience seizures, fall into a coma, and die within days. Many malaria victims recovered, especially after repeated infections built up some immunity. But some died, particularly if they were already weakened by age or other illnesses. And the symptoms, fever, sweating, organ damage, eventual death, could easily be mistaken for poisoning by anyone predisposed to see conspiracy rather than disease. The coincidence of timing deaths following Vatican dinners suggested poisoning to Renaissance observers who didn't understand disease transmission. But modern historians, understanding malaria, see a different pattern. The Borgias didn't need to poison their enemies. Summer in Rome did the work for them. Malaria deserves special attention because it killed so many people in Renaissance Rome, including, as we'll see, possibly Pope Alexander VI himself. The disease was endemic in central Italy, particularly in the summer months when mosquitoes bred prolifically in the marshy areas around Rome and in the Pontine marshes to the south. Picture what malaria does to the body. The disease is caused by a parasite transmitted through mosquito bites. Though Renaissance Romans didn't understand this mechanism, they believed malaria came from bad air, malaria in Italian, rising from swamps, which is why they called it that. They were wrong about the cause, but right that proximity to marshy areas increased risk. The symptoms begin with fever, high fever, often reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The victim sweats profusely, soaking through clothes and bedding. Then the fever breaks, the victim feels briefly better, and everyone hopes recovery is beginning. But the fever returns, cycling every 2 or 3 days, each cycle weakening the victim further. As the disease progresses, the victim develops anemia. The parasites destroy red blood cells, leaving the person pale, weak, unable to function. The spleen swells enormously, sometimes rupturing and causing death through internal bleeding. Jaundice might develop as the liver fails. If the parasite enters the brain, cerebral malaria, the victim might experience seizures, fall into a coma, and die within days. Many malaria victims recovered, especially after repeated infections built up some immunity. But some died, particularly if they were already weakened by age or other illnesses. And the symptoms, fever, sweating, organ damage, eventual death, could easily be mistaken for poisoning by anyone predisposed to see conspiracy rather than disease. Moreover, malaria struck unpredictably. One person might attend a dinner and die, while others at the same gathering survived. This too suggested selective poisoning. The Borgias had targeted specific victims, but malaria's effects varied based on factors Renaissance people couldn't know. Individual immune response, previous exposure to the disease, the particular strain of parasite, the number of infected mosquito bites. 2 people could be equally exposed and have completely different outcomes. Malaria deserves special attention because it killed so many people in Renaissance Rome, including, as we'll see, possibly Pope Alexander VI himself. The disease was endemic in central Italy, particularly in the summer months when mosquitoes bred prolifically in the marshy areas around Rome and in the Pontine marshes to the south. Picture what malaria does to the body. The disease is caused by a parasite transmitted through mosquito bites, though Renaissance Romans didn't understand this mechanism. They believed malaria came from bad air, malaria in Italian, rising from swamps, which is why they called it that. They were wrong about the cause, but right that proximity to marshy areas increased risk. The symptoms begin with fever, high fever, often reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The victim sweats profusely, soaking through clothes and bedding. Then the fever breaks, the victim feels briefly better, and everyone hopes recovery is beginning. But the fever returns, cycling every 2 or 3 days, each cycle weakening the victim further. As the disease progresses, the victim develops anemia. The parasites destroy red blood cells, leaving the person pale, weak, unable to function. The spleen swells enormously, sometimes rupturing and causing death through internal bleeding. Jaundice might develop as the liver fails. If the parasite enters the brain, cerebral malaria, the victim might experience seizures, fall into a coma, and die within days. Many malaria victims recovered, especially after repeated infections built up some immunity, but some died, particularly if they were already weakened by age or other illnesses. And the symptoms, fever, sweating, organ damage, eventual death, could easily be mistaken for poisoning by anyone predisposed to see conspiracy rather than disease. Other diseases also killed with frequency in Renaissance Rome. Typhoid fever, spread by contaminated water, caused high fever, abdominal pain, and death. Dysentery, whether bacterial or amoebic, caused violent diarrhea and dehydration. Various fevers that Renaissance doctors couldn't distinguish from each other swept through the city periodically, probably including influenza, pneumonia, and other infectious diseases. Food poisoning was common in an age without refrigeration, where meat went bad quickly in summer heat, where sanitation was poor, where understanding of food safety was minimal. A cardinal might die vomiting after a banquet, not because the food was deliberately poisoned, but because it was spoiled. The symptoms would look the same. This point cannot be emphasized enough. Disease killed far more efficiently than any poisoner. The crude poisons available in the Renaissance could not match the mortality rate of epidemic disease. A competent poisoner might kill one target with careful planning and lucky circumstances. Malaria killed hundreds without effort. Malaria deserves special attention because it killed so many people in Renaissance Rome, including, as we'll see, possibly Pope Alexander VI himself. The disease was endemic in central Italy, particularly in the summer months when mosquitoes bred prolifically in the marshy areas around Rome and in the Pontine marshes to the south. Picture what malaria does to the body. The disease is caused by a parasite transmitted through mosquito bites, though Renaissance Romans didn't understand this mechanism. They believed malaria came from bad air, malaria in Italian, rising from swamps, which is why they called it that. They were wrong about the cause, but right that proximity to marshy areas increased risk. The symptoms begin with fever, high fever, often reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The victim sweats profusely, soaking through clothes and bedding. Then the fever breaks, the victim feels briefly better, and everyone hopes recovery is beginning. But the fever returns, cycling every 2 or 3 days, each cycle weakening the victim further. As the disease progresses, the victim develops anemia. The parasites destroy red blood cells, leaving the person pale, weak, unable to function. The spleen swells enormously, sometimes rupturing and causing death through internal bleeding. Jaundice might develop as the liver fails. If the parasite enters the brain, cerebral malaria, the victim might experience seizures, fall into a coma, and die within days. Many malaria victims recovered, especially after repeated infections built up some immunity. But some died, particularly if they were already weakened by age or other illnesses. And the symptoms, fever, sweating, organ damage, eventual death could easily be mistaken for poisoning by anyone predisposed to see conspiracy rather than disease. Yet, when a cardinal died of fever in Renaissance Rome, if that cardinal had recently opposed the Pope or owed money to the Church, rumour immediately suggested poison. The death confirmed what people already believed, that the Pope was wicked, that the Borgias were murderers, that no one was safe from their malice. The actual cause of death, almost certainly disease, was less interesting than the scandal of suspected murder. This brings us to another crucial point: the power of confirmation bias in creating and sustaining the Borgia legend. Once people believed the Borgias were poisoners, every subsequent death confirmed that belief. Evidence that didn't fit the pattern was ignored or explained away. Evidence that did fit was emphasized and remembered. A cardinal who opposed the Pope dies young, poisoned obviously. A cardinal who supported the Pope dies young. Well, he must have known too much, or perhaps he was no longer useful, or the poison was meant for someone else. A cardinal who opposed the Pope lives to old age. He was lucky, or cautious, or perhaps the Borgias tried to poison him but he had a good food taster. This is how legends become self-sustaining. The Borgias could never disprove accusations of poisoning because the absence of evidence was treated as evidence of their cleverness. If no poison was detected, that proved the Borgias used a poison that couldn't be detected. If victims showed symptoms consistent with disease, that proved the Borgias had disguised murder as natural death. If some potential victims survived, that proved the Borgias were selective in their targeting. Modern historians, trained to think critically about evidence, see these accusations very differently. We know about malaria, typhoid, dysentery, and food poisoning. We know these diseases were epidemic in Renaissance Rome. We know the symptoms could easily be mistaken for poisoning. We know forensic science didn't exist. And we know the Borgias had powerful enemies with every motive to blacken their reputation. Malaria deserves special attention because it killed so many people in Renaissance Rome, including, as we'll see, possibly Pope Alexander VI himself. The disease was endemic in central Italy, particularly in the summer months when mosquitoes bred prolifically in the marshy areas around Rome and in the Pontine marshes to the south. Picture what malaria does to the body. The disease is caused by a parasite transmitted through mosquito bites. Though Renaissance Romans didn't understand this mechanism, they believed malaria came from bad air, malaria in Italian, rising from swamps, which is why they called it that. They were wrong about the cause, but right that proximity to marshy areas increased risk. The symptoms begin with fever, high fever, often reaching 104 or 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The victim sweats profusely, soaking through clothes and bedding. Then the fever breaks. The victim feels briefly better, and everyone hopes recovery is beginning. But the fever returns, cycling every 2 or 3 days, each cycle weakening the victim further. As the disease progresses, the victim develops anemia. The parasites destroy red blood cells, leaving the person pale, weak, unable to function. The spleen swells enormously, sometimes rupturing and causing death through internal bleeding. Jaundice might develop as the liver fails. If the parasite enters the brain, cerebral malaria, the victim might experience seizures, fall into a coma, and die within days. Many malaria victims recovered, especially after repeated infections built up some immunity, but some died, particularly if they were already weakened by age or other illnesses. And the symptoms, fever, sweating, organ damage, eventual death, could easily be mistaken for poisoning by anyone predisposed to see conspiracy rather than disease. When we examine specific cases of alleged Borgia poisoning with this knowledge, a pattern emerges. Most of the victims almost certainly died of disease. A few may have been murdered, but probably by conventional means: stabbing, strangling, drowning rather than poison. The systematic, widespread poisoning program attributed to the Borgias probably never existed. But before we examine these specific cases, we must meet the family members most associated with the poisoning legend. Cesare, the ruthless son who supposedly shared his father's love of poison, and Lucrezia, the daughter accused of being the family's chief poisoner, despite evidence suggesting her complete innocence. Cesare Borgia was born in 1475 or 1476, probably in Rome, the second son of Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia and his mistress Vannozza dei Catanei. From birth, he was destined for greatness, or at least, his father was determined to make him great by whatever means necessary. As a child, Cesare received the finest education available. He studied at the universities of Perugia and Pisa, learning Latin, theology, and law. He was intelligent, perhaps brilliant, with a mind that grasped complex political and military problems intuitively. He was also physically impressive, tall, strong, handsome, with dark eyes that contemporary accounts described as both captivating and unsettling. When Rodrigo became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, Cesare was 17 years old. Within a year, his father had made him a cardinal, the youngest cardinal in the college, and had appointed him to various lucrative church offices. Cesare wore the scarlet robes and hat of a prince of the church, but he chafed at the role. He wanted to be a military commander, a secular prince, a man of action rather than a churchman bound by vows and ceremonies. His frustration grew as he watched his older brother Juan receive the opportunities he craved. Juan was made Duke of Gandia, commander of the papal armies, given lands and honours that Cesare believed should be his. The brothers' relationship, never warm, deteriorated into open rivalry and possibly hatred. In June 1497, Juan disappeared after a dinner at their mother's house. His body was found in the Tiber River the next day, stabbed 9 times, his hands bound, his throat cut. Someone had murdered the Pope's favourite son and heir. Suspicion immediately fell on Cesare. Juan had been his rival, his obstacle. With Juan dead, Cesare would inherit the military and political role he desired. Contemporary observers noted that Cesare showed no grief at his brother's death, that he seemed almost satisfied, but no proof linked him to the murder. The crime was never solved, and the Pope, devastated by Juan's death, ordered the investigation closed. Whether Cesare murdered Juan remains unclear. The evidence is circumstantial motive, opportunity, temperament that made murder plausible. But no confession was ever obtained, no witness came forward, no evidence definitively established guilt. Cesare took his secret, if it was a secret, to the grave. What is certain is that Juan's death freed Cesare. In 1498, he renounced his cardinalate, becoming the first cardinal in history to voluntarily resign the position. He was done with the church. He would become what he had always wanted to be, a warrior prince. Pope Alexander arranged a marriage for Cesare with Charlotte d'Albret, a French princess, cementing an alliance with King Louis XII of France. Louis made Cesare Duke of Valentinois. Cesare would henceforth be known in Italy as Il Valentino, the Valentian. More importantly, Louis provided French military support for Cesare's campaigns to conquer territories in central Italy. From 1499 to 1503, Cesare waged a series of brilliant military campaigns, conquering city after city in the Romagna region. He took Imola, Forli, Pesaro, Rimini, Cesena, and other cities, building a state that stretched across central Italy. His methods were ruthless but effective. Cities that surrendered were treated relatively well. Cities that resisted were sacked. Rulers who opposed him were imprisoned, exiled, or killed. Cesare's reputation for cruelty grew. In Cesena, when his governor Ramiro de Lorqua became too brutal and sparked a revolt, Cesare had Ramiro arrested, executed, and his body displayed in the public square, cut in half, to demonstrate that justice had been done and to terrify anyone else who might cause problems. He was capable of personal violence. In 1499, Cesare strangled his brother-in-law Alfonso of Aragon, Lucrezia's second husband, with his own hands, or ordered his assassination, after Alfonso survived a previous attempt on his life. The murder was never officially solved, but everyone knew Cesare was responsible. Was Cesare a poisoner? The accusations against him are numerous. He supposedly poisoned the Cardinal of Capua. He supposedly poisoned various rivals and inconvenient allies. He supposedly learned the art of poison from his father and employed it throughout his career. But when we examine Cesare's documented murders, poison is notably absent. He preferred direct methods: stabbing, strangling, drowning, or simply having men killed by his guards. The murder of Alfonso of Aragon was accomplished by strangling, not poison. The execution of Ramiro de Lorqua was by sword, not poison. The deaths of various condottieri, mercenary captains, who served Cesare and then betrayed him, were accomplished by armed force, not poison. Cesare was ruthless, certainly. He killed without compunction when he judged killing necessary. But he seems to have preferred violence that sent a message, that demonstrated his power and created fear. Poison was subtle, indirect, deniable. Cesare's style was more direct. Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat and political theorist, met Cesare repeatedly during his campaigns. Machiavelli was fascinated by Cesare, seeing in him an ideal of effective political action unconstrained by conventional morality. Machiavelli's famous work, The Prince, was influenced by his observations of Cesare, and many scholars believe Cesare was the primary model for Machiavelli's Prince, a ruler who did whatever was necessary to achieve his goals, who combined the cunning of a fox with the ferocity of a lion. But significantly, Machiavelli never accuses Cesare of poisoning. Machiavelli describes Cesare's military campaigns, his political maneuvering, his willingness to break promises and betray allies when advantageous. But poison is not part of Machiavelli's portrait of Cesare. If Cesare had been a notorious poisoner, surely Machiavelli would have mentioned it either as praise for his ruthless efficiency or as criticism for excessive cruelty. Cesare's career came to an abrupt end in August 1503, when Pope Alexander VI died suddenly after attending a dinner at the Vatican. Rumors immediately circulated that the Borgias had accidentally poisoned themselves, that poison meant for several cardinals had somehow been given to the Pope and Cesare by mistake. This story is almost certainly false, as we shall examine in detail later. Both Alexander and Cesare fell ill with fever during a malaria outbreak. Alexander, aged 72 and in poor health, died. Cesare, younger and stronger, survived, though he was seriously ill for weeks. Without his father's support, Cesare's power collapsed almost immediately. The territories he had conquered rebelled or were seized by others. His enemies, held in check only by fear of Alexander's papal power, moved against him. Within months, Cesare went from being one of the most powerful men in Italy to being a fugitive. He fled to Naples, was imprisoned by Spain, escaped, and ended up in the service of his brother-in-law, the King of Navarre. In March 1507, at age 31, Cesare Borgia died in a minor skirmish in Spain, killed by soldiers besieging a castle. The man who had conquered cities, who had been feared throughout Italy, died in an obscure fight over an insignificant fortress. Cesare's legacy is complex. He was undoubtedly ruthless, capable of murder, unburdened by moral qualms about using violence to achieve his goals. He killed people, this is not in dispute. But was he a poisoner? The evidence suggests not. His documented murders were accomplished by conventional means. The poisoning accusations against him, like those against his father, seem to be largely legend, the product of enemies who found poison accusations a convenient way to blacken his reputation. If Cesare Borgia had lived longer, had held power for decades rather than just a few years, perhaps the truth about his methods would have become clearer. But he died young, his career cut short, leaving behind only a handful of years of documented brutality, and a vast cloud of accusations, rumors, and legends that his enemies cultivated for centuries. And then there is his sister, Lucrezia, who more than any other Borgia became associated with poison in the popular imagination, despite being almost certainly innocent of poisoning anyone. Lucrezia Borgia was born in April 1480 in Subiaco, a small town near Rome. She was the only daughter of Rodrigo Borgia and Vanozza dei Catanei, beloved by both parents, and from birth a valuable asset in her father's political schemes. In Renaissance Italy, daughters of powerful men were married to create alliances, and Lucrezia would be married 3 times before she was 21 years old, each marriage serving her father's changing political needs. Her childhood was comfortable. She received an excellent education unusual for women of the era, but typical for daughters of humanist-influenced families. She learned to read and write in Latin and Italian, studied poetry and music, and was trained in the social graces necessary for a woman of her station. Contemporary accounts describe her as beautiful, with long blonde hair, pale skin, and a graceful manner. Her first engagement, arranged when she was 10 years old, was to a Spanish nobleman. This engagement was broken when her father found a more advantageous match with Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a member of the powerful Sforza family that ruled Milan. Lucrezia married Giovanni in 1493 when she was 13, young even by Renaissance standards, though the marriage was not consummated until later. The marriage lasted only 4 years. When Alexander's political alignment shifted and the Sforza alliance became inconvenient, Alexander decided to dissolve Lucrezia's marriage. The grounds were non-consummation. Giovanni supposedly had been unable to perform his marital duties due to impotence. Giovanni, humiliated by this public questioning of his virility, eventually agreed to the annulment in exchange for financial compensation. But Giovanni, bitter about his treatment, began spreading malicious gossip about Lucrezia and her family. He claimed that Lucrezia had committed incest with her father and brothers. He suggested that her marriage was being dissolved not due to non-consummation but because she was pregnant by one of her relatives. These accusations were vile, false, and motivated entirely by Giovanni's desire for revenge. But they would be repeated, embellished, and believed by many, becoming part of the Borgia legend. In 1498, Lucrezia married again, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Biscaglie, an illegitimate son of the King of Naples. This marriage seems to have been genuinely happy. Alfonso was handsome, charming, close to Lucrezia in age. They had a son together, named Rodrigo after his grandfather the Pope. But Alfonso became a political liability when the Borgias shifted their alliance from Naples to France. In July 1500, Alfonso was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, stabbed multiple times by unknown assailants. He survived the attack and was taken to the Vatican to recover, with Lucrezia nursing him devotedly. But Alfonso never recovered fully because in August, as he convalesced in his Vatican apartments, he was attacked again, this time successfully. He was strangled in his bed. The killers were never officially identified, but everyone knew Cesare Borgia was responsible. Alfonso had become an obstacle to Borgia policy, and obstacles were removed. Lucrezia was devastated. She retreated to a convent for a time, refusing to see her father or brother. She had loved Alfonso, had tried to save him, had failed. The murder demonstrated her utter powerlessness in her own family's schemes. She was a pawn, valuable only for the alliances her marriages could create, disposable once those alliances became inconvenient. Her third marriage, arranged by her father in 1501, was to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duke of Ferrara. This marriage was politically brilliant for the Borgias. Ferrara was a wealthy, powerful state with a sophisticated court. For Lucrezia, it was an escape from Rome, from her family, from the scandals that surrounded her. She left Rome in 1502 and never returned. In Ferrara, she gradually built a new life. She bore several children to Alfonso, who succeeded as Duke in 1505. She became a patron of artists and poets. She governed Ferrara competently during her husband's absences. She established a reputation for piety, intelligence, and cultured refinement. The Duke of Ferrara and his court initially viewed Lucrezia with suspicion. She was a Borgia, daughter of a scandalous pope, sister of a murderer, carrying a reputation for wickedness. But over time, she won them over. The letters and diplomatic reports from Ferrara in these years describe Lucrezia in terms completely at odds with her reputation. Pious, charitable, a good mother, a capable administrator, a woman of dignity and virtue. She lived in Ferrara until her death in June 1519 at age 39, dying from complications following childbirth. She was mourned sincerely by the people of Ferrara, who had come to love her. She was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini, where her tomb remains. This was the real Lucrezia Borgia, a woman used as a pawn by her father and brother, married 3 times for political convenience, widowed tragically, rebuilt her life in Ferrara with grace and intelligence, died respected and mourned. A life of considerable accomplishment given the circumstances she faced. Now compare this reality to the legend. In popular imagination, Lucrezia Borgia is a poisoner, perhaps the most deadly poisoner of the Renaissance. The legend claims she possessed a hollow ring that could be turned to release poison into a victim's drink. She supposedly poisoned her husbands, rivals, enemies, anyone who inconvenienced her or her family. She was supposedly the Borgias' primary assassin, using her beauty to get close to victims before murdering them. None of this is true. The hollow poison ring is pure fiction, invented by later writers and repeated until it became fact. There is no contemporary evidence of such a ring existing. The technology to create a reliable poison dispensing ring was probably beyond Renaissance jewelers' capabilities. And most importantly, there is no credible evidence Lucrezia poisoned anyone. Let us examine her husband's fates. Giovanni Sforza lived until 1510, dying of natural causes at age 45, years after his annulment from Lucrezia. If she had wanted to poison him, she had ample opportunity during their marriage. She didn't. Alfonso of Aragon was killed, but by strangling, not poison, and almost certainly by Cesare's orders, not Lucrezia's. The historical record shows Lucrezia trying to protect Alfonso, not harm him. Alfonso d'Este, her third husband, lived until 1534, dying at age 57 of natural causes, 15 years after Lucrezia's own death. If she had been a poisoner, he would be the logical victim, yet he thrived during their marriage and long after. The accusations against Lucrezia came from several sources. Giovanni Sforza spread malicious gossip after their annulment. Later writers, particularly in the Counter-Reformation period when the Borgias were used as examples of pre-Reformation papal corruption, repeated and embellished these rumors. And in the 19th century, when Romantic writers became fascinated with the Borgias, they transformed Lucrezia into a femme fatale, a beautiful poisoner, a figure of Gothic horror. Victor Hugo wrote a play about Lucrezia in which she poisons numerous people. Alexandre Dumas wrote about her poison ring. Dozens of sensationalist books portrayed her as evil incarnate, and these fictional portrayals became, in public consciousness, more real than the historical Lucrezia, the woman who lived quietly in Ferrara, raised children, patronized art, and died in childbirth. Modern historians have largely rehabilitated Lucrezia's reputation. Scholarly biographies portray her as a victim of her family's ambitions, a capable woman who made the best of difficult circumstances, certainly not a poisoner or monster. But the popular image persists. Lucrezia Borgia remains, in films and novels, the beautiful woman with the poison ring, forever linked to crimes she never committed. Her story demonstrates how historical reputation can be entirely disconnected from historical reality, how political propaganda and later embellishment can create a legend that overwhelms the truth, How a woman who was largely powerless in her own life could be transformed by legend into a figure of terrifying power. If the Borgias were really systematic poisoners, Lucrezia's biography should provide evidence. Instead, it provides evidence of the opposite, a woman whose life was shaped by others' violence, not by her own, whose reputation as a poisoner is entirely undeserved. But what about the specific cases? What about the deaths that were attributed to Borgia poisoning? Let us examine the most famous accusations, looking at what we actually know versus what legend claims. The list of people supposedly poisoned by the Borgias is long dozens of names, perhaps more, accumulated over decades of accusations. But when we examine specific cases with historical rigor, the evidence of actual poisoning becomes remarkably thin. Let us consider the most prominent examples. The most famous Borgia poisoning accusation concerns events in August 1503. According to legend, Pope Alexander VI planned to poison several wealthy cardinals at a dinner party, intending to seize their fortunes when they died. The poison was supposedly prepared by Cesare and placed in wine, but through a mix-up or accident, the poisoned wine was served to Alexander and Cesare instead, and both fell mortally ill. Alexander died on August 18, 1503. Cesare survived but was seriously ill for weeks. Several cardinals who attended dinners at the Vatican around this time also died. This certainly sounds like evidence of poisoning, but examine the circumstances more carefully. August in Rome, height of malaria season, epidemic disease sweeping the city. Alexander was 72 years old, obese, in poor health. He had been complaining of fever even before the famous dinner. Cesare was younger and stronger, which is why he survived an illness that killed his father. The symptoms described in contemporary accounts, high fever, vomiting, delirium, are entirely consistent with malaria. They are also consistent with arsenic poisoning, which is why suspicions arose. But malaria is far more likely given the time, place, and epidemiological context. Moreover, the poisoned wine accident story appears only in sources hostile to the Borgias, written after Alexander's death, when there was no risk in making such accusations. Sources friendly to or neutral toward the Borgias describe Alexander's death as natural illness, as malaria, without mentioning poison. If Alexander and Cesare had really been accidentally poisoned with their own poison, this would be a spectacularly incompetent error. The Pope and his son, supposedly master poisoners, supposedly careful and clever, somehow confuse which wine contains poison? It seems unlikely. The more prosaic explanation that Alexander contracted malaria and died, that Cesare caught it too but survived, that other cardinals who died around the same time also died of disease is far more probable, but it lacks drama. The accidental poisoning story is better, more poetic, a fitting end for those who live by poison dying by poison. So the legend was created and repeated until it became accepted fact. Cardinal Giovanni Michiel died in April 1503, 4 months before Alexander. Michiel had attended a dinner at the Vatican on April 10th. He fell ill the next day and died within a week. His death was immediately attributed to poisoning by the Borgias. But again, examine the circumstances. April, in Rome, beginning of disease season, a man in his 60s dying of fever after a week's illness. This could be poison. It could also be dozens of natural causes. Without forensic evidence, we cannot know. The accusation gains weight from the fact that Michiel left a large fortune that passed to the church when he died. This gave the Borgias motive. They supposedly poisoned him to seize his wealth, but cardinals leaving their fortunes to the church was standard practice. The church expected it, and most cardinals, lacking legitimate heirs, complied. Michiel's death benefited the church, but so did every cardinal's death. This doesn't prove poisoning. Cardinal Giambattista Orsini died in February 1503, again after dining at the Vatican. The Orsini family were enemies of the Borgias, so his death seemed suspicious. Again, the accusation of poisoning circulated. And again, the evidence is circumstantial at best. Orsini was elderly, died after several days of fever during a period when respiratory infections were common. His death could be natural, or it could be poisoning. We cannot know. The pattern repeats. A cardinal dies, benefits the Borgias in some way, or was their enemy, and is claimed to have been poisoned. But fever was epidemic. People died constantly. The correlation between attending Vatican dinners and dying does not prove causation. It could simply reflect that sick people attended dinners, not knowing they were already infected with disease, and then died of their illness. This is the fundamental problem with all Borgia poisoning accusations: lack of proof. Renaissance Italy had no forensic science. Bodies were not examined for poison because no one knew how to detect it. Symptoms could be interpreted as either disease or poisoning, and accusations came from enemies with political motives to blacken the Borgia name. Modern historians examining these cases find that most deaths occurred during disease seasons: summer for malaria, spring and fall for other fevers. Symptoms described are consistent with natural diseases epidemic in Rome. The accusers were Borgia enemies with motives to lie. Sources friendly to the Borgias don't mention poisoning. This doesn't prove the Borgias never poisoned anyone. Proving a negative is impossible. Perhaps they did poison a few people, and those deaths have been lost in the noise of hundreds of natural deaths. But the systematic poisoning program of legend, dozens of victims, secret formulas, a family of master poisoners, is not supported by evidence. So if the Borgias weren't poisoners, what were they? They were typical Renaissance rulers, using typical Renaissance methods: military force, political alliances, bribery, nepotism, and occasional murder by conventional means. Cesare Borgia killed people. We know this. He strangled Alfonso of Aragon. He ordered the execution of Ramiro de Lorqua. He probably killed his brother Juan, though this remains unproven. He fought wars, besieged cities, executed prisoners, but these were the normal actions of Renaissance military commanders. Pope Alexander sold church offices, appointed his relatives to positions, waged war against enemies, seized territories. But these were the normal actions of Renaissance popes. Alexander was more brazen than most, more shameless about his mistresses and children, more openly nepotistic. But in terms of actual policy, he was not dramatically different from other popes of the era. The Borgias' real crime was being Spanish in Italy, being successful, and making powerful enemies. Their enemies, the Orsini, the Colonna, the Della Rovere, the Venetians, the Florentines, the Neapolitans, all had reasons to hate them. When Alexander died and the Borgias fell from power, these enemies controlled the narrative. They spread stories of Borgia wickedness, emphasizing every scandal, exaggerating every crime, inventing accusations where none existed. The poisoning legend was the most successful of these inventions. It combined several elements that made it believable and memorable: exotic Spanish knowledge, the supposed secret of Cantarella, violation of trust, poison at dinners, and the appearance of moral judgment. Those who live by poison die by poison. The legend fit Renaissance Italians' prejudices about Spaniards, about the corruption of the papal court, about the nature of evil, and once established, the legend proved impossible to dislodge. Each generation repeated it, added to it, used it for their own purposes. Counter-Reformation Catholics used the Borgias as examples of pre-Reformation papal corruption, arguing this proved the Church needed reform. Protestant polemicists used the Borgias to attack the papacy itself. Enlightenment writers used them to criticize religion generally. Romantic writers transformed them into Gothic villains, and in each retelling, the poison legend grew stronger, more detailed, more confirmed by the repetition itself. If we want to understand whether the Borgias were truly poisoners, the death of Pope Alexander VI provides the crucial test. If the Borgias had really possessed secret poisons and used them freely, Alexander's death should provide clear evidence. After all, the circumstances, a pope dying after a dinner at the Vatican, his son simultaneously falling ill in the middle of summer, seemed to practically demand a poison explanation. The traditional story, as we've mentioned, claims Alexander and Cesare were accidentally poisoned with their own poison. But let us examine what actually happened in August 1503, using contemporary sources and modern understanding of disease. In early August, Rome was suffering one of its worst malaria outbreaks in years. The summer had been particularly hot and humid, perfect conditions for mosquito breeding. People were dying in large numbers. Cardinals and other wealthy Romans were fleeing to their country estates to escape the bad air. Pope Alexander, at age 72, was not in good health. He was obese. Contemporary descriptions and paintings show a heavy-set man with a thick neck and large belly. He suffered from gout. He tired easily. But he was still active, still engaged in papal business, still hosting dinners and meetings. On August 5th, Alexander attended a dinner at the vineyard villa of Cardinal Adriano Castellesi. Cesare was also present. The dinner was held outdoors in the evening, a pleasant way to escape the heat, but also maximum exposure to mosquitoes. Several other prelates attended. Within days, both Alexander and Cesare developed high fever. Contemporary accounts describe Alexander as suffering from terrible fever, becoming delirious, vomiting, his skin turning dark. His doctors and Renaissance popes had multiple physicians tried various treatments, bloodletting, purges, cooling baths. Nothing helped. Alexander died on August 18th, 13 days after the dinner. Cesare was also desperately ill, but younger and stronger. He survived, though he remained weak for weeks. Cardinal Castellesi, in whose vineyard the dinner had occurred, also fell ill, but he survived. Now, if this was poisoning, we must ask, who was the intended target? If the Borgias were trying to poison cardinals, why did only Alexander and Cesare fall ill initially? If someone was trying to poison the Borgias, why did Cardinal Castellesi also get sick? The malaria explanation makes much more sense. The dinner was held in an area with standing water, perfect mosquito habitat. Everyone at the dinner was exposed to infected mosquitoes. Some were bitten and contracted malaria. Others were either not bitten or had some immunity from previous exposure. Alexander, elderly and in poor health, could not fight off the disease. Cesare, younger, survived. Castellesi, perhaps with partial immunity, survived. The pattern fits mosquito-borne disease perfectly. It fits poisoning poorly. Poison doesn't selectively affect people based on age and health status in quite this way. The descriptions of Alexander's symptoms also match malaria better than arsenic poisoning. Malaria causes cyclical fever, rising and falling every 2 to 3 days, as parasites multiply in the blood, delirium, organ failure, and, in severe cases, blackening of the skin as capillaries fail and tissues die. Arsenic causes more immediate gastrointestinal distress, burning sensations, and death usually occurs faster. Moreover, if Cesare had really been poisoned, why didn't he immediately accuse his enemies? He had nothing to gain from silence. If he believed he and his father had been poisoned by rivals, he should have launched investigations, arrests, executions. Instead, he seems to have believed correctly that they had fallen ill naturally, victims of the Roman summer that killed thousands every year. After Alexander's death, his body was prepared for burial. Here we encounter another element of the poison legend. Accounts claim Alexander's corpse swelled grotesquely, turned black, began to decompose unusually rapidly, with blood and fluids leaking from his mouth and nose. These details were cited as evidence of poisoning, but these symptoms are actually evidence of rapid decomposition in hot weather. exacerbated by the bloodletting and other medical treatments Alexander received while dying. A body in August in Rome, not properly preserved, will decompose rapidly. The swelling and discoloration are normal putrefaction. The fact that Alexander's body showed these signs proves only that he died in summer and wasn't immediately embalmed. The poison legend required Alexander's death to be unnatural, spectacular, obvious evidence of the evil he had practiced coming back upon him. But the reality was probably mundane. An elderly, obese man contracted malaria, a common disease, and died, as thousands of others died every summer in Rome. There was no cosmic justice, no poetic ending, just a mosquito bite and a death from disease. After Alexander's death, Cesare's power collapsed. Without his father's support, he could not hold on to the territories he had conquered. Within months, he was a fugitive. He never spoke of being poisoned. In his letters from this period, he attributes his father's death to natural causes, to the fever that struck them both. If he had believed poison was involved, surely he would have said so. It would have served his interests to blame his enemies for his father's death. The poison explanation only appears in sources hostile to the Borgias, written after Alexander's death, when there was no way to verify the claims and no risk in making accusations. These sources had every reason to promote the poison story. It confirmed what they wanted people to believe about the Borgias, and it explained Alexander's death in a way that seemed like divine judgment. But divine judgment works better as narrative than as history. History must deal with evidence, with probability, with what we can actually prove, rather than what makes a good story. And the evidence strongly suggests Alexander died of malaria, not poison. If the circumstances of Alexander's death, which seemed almost designed to suggest poisoning, turn out on examination to indicate natural disease, what does this tell us about all the other alleged Borgia poisonings? It suggests that most of them, perhaps all of them, were also natural deaths, misinterpreted as murder by people predisposed to believe the worst about the Borgias. The Borgia story demonstrates how historical legends are created and why they persist even when contradicted by evidence. Understanding this process helps us understand not just the Borgias, but how reputation works, how propaganda shapes historical memory, and why certain stories become common knowledge despite being false. Stage 1. Contemporary propaganda. The Borgia legend began during their lifetime, spread by their enemies. The Orsini, Colonna, and Della Rovere families hated the Borgias for political reasons. The Borgias had displaced them from power, seized their territories, appointed Spanish rather than Italian cardinals. These families had access to diplomats, had connections to writers and pamphleteers, and used these resources to spread damaging stories. The accusations were strategic. You could not simply call the Pope evil, that would be heresy, but you could whisper that he was dissolute, that he kept mistresses, that he appointed unqualified relatives, and you could hint that the deaths of various cardinals and nobles were not natural, that poison might be involved, that the Borgias were not just politically ruthless, but actually murderous. These whispers spread through diplomatic correspondence, through private letters, through conversations in courts across Italy and Europe. They were not published openly, that would be too dangerous while the Borgias held power. But they circulated, they were repeated, they were believed by people who wanted to believe them. Stage 2. The Fall and the Reckoning. When Alexander died and Cesare's power collapsed, the whispers became shouts. Now there was no risk in openly accusing the Borgias. Books and pamphlets appeared detailing Borgia crimes, real and imagined. The accounts grew more elaborate with each retelling. Chronicles written in the years after Alexander's death described the Borgias in lurid terms. Some of these accounts came from people who had been in Rome during the Borgia era and had genuine knowledge. Others came from people repeating second-hand stories, embellishing for effect, and others were pure invention, creating scenarios that fit the narrative of Borgia evil, whether or not they had any basis in reality. During this period, the poison legend solidified. The vague accusations of the Borgia era became detailed descriptions of specific poisonings. The name Cantarella appeared for the first time. No contemporary source from Alexander's lifetime mentions it, but sources written 10 or 20 years after his death describe it as if it were established fact. Stage 3. Religious propaganda. The Counter-Reformation, the Catholic Church's response to Protestant criticism, used the Borgias as a cautionary tale. Counter-Reformation writers acknowledged that the Renaissance papacy had been corrupt, but they argued this proved the Church needed the reforms that were now being implemented. The Borgias became the exemplar of pre-Reformation corruption, their sins exaggerated to make the Reformed Church look better by comparison. At the same time, Protestant polemicists used the Borgias to attack the papacy itself. Here, they said, is what popes really are: not holy spiritual leaders, but corrupt politicians, murderers, poisoners, fornicators. The Borgia story became ammunition in religious warfare, with both sides using it for their own purposes, neither side particularly concerned with historical accuracy. Stage 4. Romantic embellishment. In the 19th century, Romantic writers discovered the Borgias and transformed them into figures of Gothic horror and fascination. Victor Hugo, Alexandre Dumas, and others wrote plays and novels that portrayed the Borgias as supremely evil, but also fascinating, powerful, and in a perverse way, admirable in their total commitment to their dark arts. Lucrezia's poison ring was invented during this period. There is no evidence for it from any earlier source. Cesare became a Byronic hero-villain, beautiful and damned. Alexander became a monster of vice. The historical Borgias, complex people navigating a complex world, were simplified into caricatures, but caricatures that perfectly fit romantic aesthetics. These fictional versions were hugely popular and spread far beyond academic historical discourse. Most people's knowledge of the Borgias came not from historical sources, but from novels, plays, and later films. The fictional Borgias became more real than the historical ones. Stage 5. Modern persistence. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Borgia legend persists despite scholarly attempts to complicate or correct it. Popular histories, historical novels, television series, and films continue to portray the Borgias as poisoners. Why? First, because the story is dramatic. Spanish family uses political maneuvering and occasional conventional murder to gain power in Renaissance Italy is historically accurate, but less interesting than master poisoners use secret formulas to kill. Dos ends. Second, because correcting the legend requires explaining complex historical and epidemiological evidence. It's easier to repeat the legend than to explain why it's mostly false. Third, because the legend confirms comfortable assumptions about the past, that the Renaissance was wicked, that the papal court was corrupt, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. The Borgia legend fits narratives we already believe. And fourth, because there's a grain of truth to the legend. The Borgias were ruthless. They did kill people. They were corrupt by modern standards. The fact that they probably weren't poisoners doesn't make them admirable. So why bother correcting the record? But historical accuracy matters, even for figures we don't particularly like. The Borgias deserve to be judged for what they actually did, not for crimes they didn't commit. Lucrezia Borgia especially deserves better than to be remembered as a poisoner when she was actually a victim of her family's ambitions, who rebuilt her life with grace and competence. Moreover, the Borgia legend teaches us to be skeptical of historical common knowledge. If something this widely believed can be largely false, what else do we accept as fact that closer examination would reveal as legend? The process by which the Borgia legend was created, political propaganda, religious warfare, literary embellishment, and the persistence of dramatic stories over boring truth, operates in many areas of history. Understanding how it worked with the Borgias helps us recognize it elsewhere. Having examined the evidence and found the poisoning legend largely false, What can we say about the real Borgias? Who were they? What did they actually do? And what does their story tell us about Renaissance Italy and about power more generally? Rodrigo Borgia was one of the most capable administrators ever to hold the papacy. He was an excellent manager, a skilled diplomat, and a clever politician. He expanded the papal states, successfully navigated the complex alliances among Italian powers and European kingdoms, and left the Church's finances in better shape than he found them. He was also utterly corrupt by any standard of Christian morality. He bought his office through bribery. He kept mistresses openly. He promoted his illegitimate children shamelessly. He used church revenues to enrich his family. He waged war not for religious purposes, but for political gain. Yet he was sincerely religious in his way. He attended Mass daily. He believed in the doctrines of the Church. He commissioned religious art. His faith and his corruption coexisted without apparent contradiction because Renaissance people separated public role from private virtue in ways that seem hypocritical to modern minds but were normal then. Was he a murderer? Possibly. He operated in a world where political rivals sometimes died suspiciously convenient deaths. He may have ordered murders, or at least he created an environment where subordinates knew that removing obstacles to Borgia interests would be rewarded. But systematic poisoning? The evidence doesn't support it. Cesare Borgia was a brilliant military commander and a ruthless political operator. He conquered and held territories through a combination of military force, political maneuvering, and selective brutality that intimidated enemies while reassuring allies. Machiavelli admired him for good reason. Cesare understood power and used it effectively. He was also capable of shocking cruelty. The murder of Alfonso of Aragon, his brother-in-law, demonstrated his willingness to kill even family members when they became obstacles. The execution of Ramiro de Lorqua, displayed as a grotesque warning, showed his taste for theatrical violence. But again, poisoner? Cesare's documented murders were by stabbing, strangling, or armed force. If he possessed secret poison formulas, he didn't rely on them. He preferred direct action, violence that sent messages, and created fear. Cesare's tragedy was that his entire power base rested on his father's papacy. When Alexander died, Cesare had nothing, no independent support, no secure territories, no reliable allies. He fell as rapidly as he had risen, dying ignominiously in an obscure fight in Spain. Lucrezia Borgia was a Renaissance woman navigating impossible circumstances. She was married 3 times by age 21, each time for her family's political advantage, with no regard for her own wishes. She lost her second husband to her brother's violence. She bore children, managed households, and eventually governed a major Italian state competently. She was not a poisoner. She was not evil. She was a capable, intelligent woman who made the best of a difficult situation, who found some happiness in Ferrara after escaping her family's sphere, who was slandered by contemporaries and sensationalized by later writers for reasons having nothing to do with her actual character or actions. Her story is, perhaps, the most instructive of all. It shows how women in history can be vilified simply for being connected to powerful men, how sexual slander can destroy reputation regardless of truth, and how legends can completely obscure historical reality. The Borgia story teaches several lessons about power, reputation, and historical memory. 1. Power makes enemies, and enemies create legends. The Borgias' real sin was being successful in a ruthless age. Their methods were not dramatically different from their contemporaries, but they succeeded more spectacularly and made more powerful enemies. Those enemies used propaganda effectively, creating a legend that outlasted the Borgias themselves. 2. Dramatic narratives overwhelm boring truth. The poison legend persists because it's more interesting than the reality. Politician uses conventional Renaissance methods to gain power is true but dull. Master poisoners kill dozens with secret formula is false but gripping. The human mind prefers drama to accuracy. 3. Absence of evidence can never disprove determined belief. No matter how thoroughly historians demonstrate the lack of evidence for Borgia poisoning, believers can always claim the Borgias were so clever they left no evidence. This is unfalsifiable. You cannot reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into. 4. Women are judged by different standards than men. Cesare killed people, this is documented fact, yet he's often portrayed as a complex anti-hero. Lucrezia probably killed no one but is remembered as a poisoner. Male violence is normalized, even admired. Female violence, even fictional female violence, is particularly horrifying. 5. Sources matter. Much of what we know about the Borgias comes from their enemies, or from writers working centuries later with agendas of their own. When we examine contemporary sources carefully, the poison legend collapses. But most people never examine sources they absorb, received wisdom that may be entirely false. Finally, we must understand the Borgias in their historical context. Renaissance Italy was violent, competitive, and unstable. The political system was essentially anarchic, multiple powers competing for dominance, alliances shifting constantly, war endemic. In this environment, ruthlessness was necessary for survival. The Borgias operated by the rules of their time. They used nepotism, bribery, and violence, but so did everyone else. They were foreign, which made them vulnerable to ethnic prejudice. They were successful, which made them threatening. They fell from power catastrophically, which meant their enemies could slander them without fear of retaliation. Were they moral by modern standards? No. But neither were the Medici, the Sforza, the Della Rovere, or any other major Renaissance family. All of them enriched themselves through church offices. All of them waged private wars. All of them murdered rivals. The Borgias were typical, not exceptional, except in the success of the propaganda campaign against them. The poison legend is fiction. The Borgias' real crimes, nepotism, corruption, occasional conventional murder, are sufficient to judge them by. We don't need to add fictional poisonings to make them villains. They were villains, certainly, by any standard of Christian morality or even Renaissance standards of acceptable behavior. But they were not the unique monsters of legend. They were typical Renaissance rulers, operating in a brutal system, doing what seemed necessary to survive and prosper. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson. The Borgias scare us not because they were so different from their contemporaries, but because they succeeded so dramatically, because they showed what Renaissance political principles taken to their logical conclusion looked like. They held up a mirror to their age, and their age didn't like what it saw. So it created a legend of Borgia evil, projecting onto one family the sins of an entire era, allowing everyone else to claim moral high ground they didn't deserve. The Borgias were not poisoners, they were politicians, and in the end, that may be more damning than any amount of poison. 5 centuries after Pope Alexander VI's death, the Borgia name still carries weight. Call someone a Borgia, and everyone understands you're accusing them of ruthless cunning, of hidden violence, of poisonous ambition. The family that ruled the papacy for barely a decade created a legend that has lasted half a millennium. But as we have seen, the legend and the reality diverge sharply. The Borgias were ruthless Renaissance politicians, not supernatural master criminals. They used the tools available to them: bribery, nepotism, military force, and occasionally murder, to advance their interests in a brutally competitive environment. These tools were standard for their time and place. What made the Borgias notable was not their methods, but their foreign origins, their success, and their vulnerability when that success ended. The poison legend served multiple purposes. For the Borgias' contemporary enemies, it was a weapon, a way to destroy reputation when direct confrontation was impossible or dangerous. For later religious polemicists, it was a cautionary tale, an example of corruption requiring reform. For Romantic writers, it was a source of dramatic material, deliciously wicked characters for novels and plays. And for modern popular culture, It remains a useful shorthand for evil, a name that carries instant recognition and associations. But history requires more than useful legends. History requires us to examine evidence, to question assumptions, to separate what we can prove from what we want to believe. When we apply this rigor to the Borgia poisoning legend, it collapses. We find disease where poison was claimed, natural death where murder was suspected, propaganda where fact was asserted. This doesn't exonerate the Borgias. Rodrigo bought his papacy and corrupted the church. Cesare murdered his brother-in-law and countless others. Both father and son used their positions to enrich themselves and their family at the expense of Christian morality and the spiritual mission of the church. These are real crimes, documented crimes, crimes for which they deserve condemnation. But they were not poisoners, or at least there is no reliable evidence they were. And this distinction matters. It matters because historical truth matters. It matters because people deserve to be judged for their actual crimes, not invented ones. And it matters because Lucrezia Borgia, who probably never harmed anyone, deserves better than to be remembered as one of history's great poisoners. The study of the Borgias teaches us to be skeptical of historical common knowledge, to question legends even when they're widespread, to examine the sources of our information and the motives of those who created it. It teaches us about Renaissance Italy, about the papacy, about power and its exercise in an age very different from our own. And it teaches us about how reputation is made and unmade, how propaganda works, and how difficult it is to correct a falsehood once it becomes established. The real Borgias, ambitious, capable, corrupt, violent, within the norms of their age, are interesting enough without the poison legend. The world they inhabited, Renaissance Rome, in all its splendor and squalor, its artistic magnificence and moral corruption, its beauty and brutality is fascinating without needing embellishment. The questions their story raises about power and morality, about reputation and reality, about how we judge historical figures are worth grappling with seriously. The Borgias were not masters of poison. They were masters of politics in an age when politics was played for the highest stakes with the fewest rules. They won spectacular victories and suffered catastrophic defeats. They built and they destroyed. They created art and they created suffering. They were, in short, very human, flawed, capable, ruthless, and far more complex than any legend could capture. The wine you were afraid to drink at that imaginary Vatican banquet in 1503? It probably wasn't poisoned. It was just wine. The real danger came not from secret powders in cups, but from mosquitoes in the summer air, from disease that killed more efficiently than any human murderer, from the endemic violence of an age that saw human life as cheap and power as everything. The Borgias understood this world and operated within it successfully. That they have been remembered as something more than successful Renaissance politicians, as legendary poisoners, as uniquely evil says more about the power of legend than about the power of poison. The gentle art they supposedly mastered was not the art of poison but the art of power. And in that art, for a brief moment, they were indeed masters. But power is fleeting. The Borgias fell, their enemies triumphed, and the legends created by those enemies endured long after the truth was forgotten. In the end, perhaps the greatest Borgia victim was not any of the people they supposedly poisoned, but truth itself murdered not by poison but by propaganda, buried not in the Tiber but under layers of accusation, rumor, and myth that 5 centuries have not been enough to dispel. Let us examine in detail the death of Pope Alexander VI, because this event is often cited as proof of Borgia poisoning, and actually proves the opposite. The events of August 1493 provide perhaps our clearest window into what really happened versus what legend claims happened. Imagine Rome in August 1493. Picture the brutal heat. The summer heat is brutal, as it always is in August. The Tiber River runs low and sluggish, its water barely moving, perfect breeding ground for mosquitoes. cases of malaria are appearing throughout the city. The disease is so common it barely merits comment unless someone important falls ill. On August 5th, Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare attend a dinner at the villa of Cardinal Adriano Castellesi. It's an outdoor banquet, held in the evening when the heat is slightly less oppressive. The guests dine in gardens overlooking the city, enjoying wine and conversation as the sun sets and darkness brings relief from the day's furnace-like temperatures. Within days, both Alexander and Cesare fall ill. According to contemporary accounts, they both develop high fevers, severe enough that servants send for physicians immediately. Both experience stomach problems, vomiting, inability to keep down food or water. Both become dangerously weak. Now here's where legend diverges from documented fact. The legend, propagated by the Borgias' enemies, claims that father and son had planned to poison Cardinal Castellesi to seize his wealth. A servant supposedly mixed up the wine cups, and the Borgias accidentally drank the poison they'd prepared for their victim. This makes a satisfying story the poisoners hoist on their own petard, killed by their own weapon, justice served through ironic mistake. But examine the actual evidence. Cardinal Castellesi didn't get sick at all. If poisoned wine was served, why did only the Borgias drink it? Why didn't other guests fall ill? The story makes no logical sense. More importantly, look at the disease progression. Both men developed fevers on the same timeline, suggesting they were exposed to the same disease at the same time, exactly what would happen if they were both bitten by infected mosquitoes at the outdoor dinner. Cesare was younger and stronger. He survived, though he was desperately ill for weeks. Alexander was 72 years old, obese, probably suffering from various age-related ailments. He died within days. Imagine the deathbed scene. Picture Alexander VI in his final hours. He lies in his bed in the Vatican palace, sweating profusely despite servants' efforts to cool him with wet cloths. The fever has him delirious, muttering incoherently. His skin has taken on a yellowish-tinged jaundice, suggesting his liver is failing. His breathing is laboured, rasping, as his lungs fill with fluid. Cardinals gather, ostensibly to pray for his recovery, but really to position themselves for the coming papal election. Servants whisper about whether Cesare will recover, whether the Borgia power will survive the Pope's death. Alexander VI dies on August 18th, 1493, 13 days after the dinner at Castellesi's villa. The timeline fits malaria perfectly. The incubation period, the progression of symptoms, the eventual organ failure. It doesn't fit arsenic poisoning at all, which would have killed him within hours or days at most, not nearly 2 weeks. But legend doesn't care about timelines or medical evidence. Within months, stories circulate. The Borgias were poisoners, everyone knew it, and finally their own poison killed them. The story is too perfect, too satisfying, to be questioned. And 5 centuries later, people still repeat it, despite all evidence to the contrary. This is how legends are made. A malaria death, perfectly explicable and medically consistent, is transformed through repetition and embellishment into proof of poisoning. The fact that the story makes no logical sense, that it contradicts documented evidence, that it violates basic understanding of how poisons work, none of this matters once the legend takes hold. The death of Alexander VI doesn't prove the Borgias were poisoners. It proves that their enemies were skilled propagandists who understood that a dramatic lie, endlessly repeated, becomes accepted as truth. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson. The Borgias scare us, not because they were so different from their contemporaries, but because they succeeded so dramatically, because they showed what Renaissance political principles taken to their logical conclusion looked like. They held up a mirror to their age, and their age didn't like what it saw, so it created a legend of Borgia evil, projecting onto one family the sins of an entire era, allowing everyone else to claim moral high ground they didn't deserve. The Borgias were not poisoners, they were politicians, and in the end, that may be more damning than any amount of poison. 5 centuries after Pope Alexander VI's death, the Borgia name still carries weight. Call someone a Borgia, and everyone understands you're accusing them of ruthless cunning, of hidden violence, of poisonous ambition. The family that ruled the papacy for barely a decade created a legend that has lasted half a millennium, but as we have seen, the legend and the reality diverge sharply. The Borgias were ruthless Renaissance politicians, not supernatural master criminals. They used the tools available to them: bribery, nepotism, military force, and occasionally murder, to advance their interests in a brutally competitive environment. These tools were standard for their time and place. What made the Borgias notable was not their methods, but their foreign origins, their success, and their vulnerability when that success ended. The poison legend served multiple purposes. For the Borgias' contemporary enemies, it was a weapon, a way to destroy reputation when direct confrontation was impossible or dangerous. For later religious polemicists, it was a cautionary tale, an example of corruption requiring reform. For romantic writers, it was a source of dramatic material, deliciously wicked characters for novels and plays. And for modern popular culture, it remains a useful shorthand for evil, a name that carries instant recognition and associations. But history requires more than useful legends. History requires us to examine evidence, to question assumptions, to separate what we can prove from what we want to believe. When we apply this rigor to the Borgia poisoning legend, it collapses. We find disease where poison was claimed, natural death where murder was suspected, propaganda where fact was asserted. This doesn't exonerate the Borgias. Rodrigo bought his papacy and corrupted the church. Cesare murdered his brother-in-law and countless others. Both father and son used their positions to enrich themselves and their family at the expense of Christian morality and the spiritual mission of the church. These are real crimes, documented crimes, crimes for which they deserve condemnation. But they were not poisoners, or at least there is no reliable evidence they were. And this distinction matters. It matters because historical truth matters. It matters because people deserve to be judged for their actual crimes, not invented ones. And it matters because Lucrezia Borgia, who probably never harmed anyone, deserves better than to be remembered as one of history's great poisoners. The study of the Borgias teaches us to be skeptical of historical common knowledge, to question legends even when they're widespread, to examine the sources of our information and the motives of those who created it. It teaches us about Renaissance Italy, about the papacy, about power and its exercise in an age very different from our own. And it teaches us about how reputation is made and unmade, how propaganda works, and how difficult it is to correct a falsehood once it becomes established. The real Borgias, ambitious, capable, corrupt, violent within the norms of their age, are interesting enough without the poison legend. The world they inhabited, Renaissance Rome, in all its splendor and squalor, its artistic magnificence and moral corruption, its beauty and brutality is fascinating without needing embellishment. The questions their story raises about power and morality, about reputation and reality, about how we judge historical figures are worth grappling with seriously. The Borgias were not masters of poison. They were masters of politics, in an age when politics was played for the highest stakes with the fewest rules. They won spectacular victories and suffered catastrophic defeats. They built and they destroyed. They created art and they created suffering. They were, in short, very human, flawed, capable, ruthless, and far more complex than any legend could capture. The wine you were afraid to drink at that imaginary Vatican banquet in 1503? It probably wasn't poisoned. It was just wine. The real danger came not from secret powders in cups, but from mosquitoes in the summer air, from disease that killed more efficiently than any human murderer, from the endemic violence of an age that saw human life as cheap and power as everything. The Borgias understood this world and operated within it, successfully. that they have been remembered as something more than successful Renaissance politicians, as legendary poisoners, as uniquely evil, says more about the power of legend than about the power of poison. The gentle art they supposedly mastered was not the art of poison, but the art of power. And in that art, for a brief moment, they were indeed masters. But power is fleeting. The Borgias fell, their enemies triumphed, and the legends created by those enemies endured long after the truth was forgotten. In the end, perhaps the greatest Borgia victim was not any of the people they supposedly poisoned, but truth itself, murdered not by poison but by propaganda, buried not in the Tiber but under layers of accusation, rumour, and myth that 5 centuries have not been enough to dispel. As we conclude our investigation, let us consider what the Borgia legend teaches us, not about Renaissance poison, but about how history is written, how reputations are made and destroyed, and why separating truth from myth matters. First, the legend teaches us about the power of propaganda. The Borgias had many enemies: rival Italian families, displaced church officials, Protestant reformers who needed examples of Catholic corruption. All had motives to exaggerate Borgia crimes, to transform political ruthlessness into legendary evil. They succeeded so completely that 5 centuries later, most people still know the Borgias were master poisoners, despite the absence of credible evidence. This matters because similar propaganda operates today. Politicians are demonized by opponents. Public figures are defined by their worst alleged acts rather than their complete record. Conspiracy theories spread because they're satisfying narratives, not because they're supported by evidence. Understanding how the Borgia legend was created should make us more skeptical when we encounter similar patterns in contemporary discourse. Second, the legend reveals how gender shapes historical judgment. Lucrezia Borgia was primarily slandered not for anything she did, but for being a powerful woman in an era when women weren't supposed to have power. The poison accusations served to delegitimize her influence, to transform a skilled diplomat and patron of arts into a femme fatale who supposedly seduced and murdered her way to influence. This pattern repeats throughout history. Powerful women are accused of sexual manipulation, of using poison, a feminine weapon, rather than honest force. Catherine de' Medici, accused of poisoning. Agrippina the Younger, accused of poisoning. Cleopatra, accused of sexual manipulation and poisoning. The specific accusations vary, but the underlying message is consistent. Women shouldn't have power, and women who do must have obtained it through deception and murder rather than ability. Third, the legend demonstrates the endurance of good stories over accurate history. The true story of the Borgias, a talented but ruthless family who rose to power through the corruption of Renaissance church politics, achieved remarkable things, then fell when conditions changed, is actually fascinating. But it's complex, morally ambiguous, requires understanding Renaissance politics and church history. The legendary story is simpler and more dramatic. Evil family develops secret poison, murders everyone who opposes them, eventually killed by their own weapon. It's a morality play with clear villains, with cosmic justice served. It's the kind of story people want to believe, which makes it the story that survives regardless of evidence. Understanding this should make us more careful about which historical narratives we accept. The most dramatic story isn't necessarily the true one. The most widely believed account isn't necessarily accurate. Sometimes boring explanations, disease, not poison, politics, not conspiracy, are actually correct even when they're less satisfying. Finally, the Borgia legend reminds us that history is written by survivors, not by truth seekers. The Borgias fell from power. Their enemies survived and triumphed. Those enemies wrote the histories, created the legends, defined how we remember the Borgia era. The Borgias themselves had no chance to present their defense, to offer their version of events, to challenge the accusations against them. This is a fundamental problem in historical analysis. We're dependent on records created by people with their own biases, agendas, and limitations. The Borgias' enemies had every reason to exaggerate their crimes. Protestant reformers had ideological reasons to portray Renaissance popes as corrupt. Romantic writers in later centuries had literary reasons to transform the Borgias into legendary villains. Each layer of retelling added new details, new crimes, new evil, until the real Borgias disappeared beneath the accumulated legend. Recovering the truth requires skepticism, careful evaluation of sources, willingness to accept that exciting stories might be false. It requires understanding that absence of evidence is actually evidence of absence when we're talking about crimes that would have required extensive physical evidence if they really happened. And it requires accepting that sometimes the boring explanation malaria, not poison, is actually correct. The Borgias were not saints. Rodrigo Borgia bought the papacy through bribery. Cesare Borgia murdered political opponents. The family engaged in nepotism, corruption, and violence that was spectacular even by Renaissance standards. These documented crimes are serious enough without adding mythical poison murders to their account, but they were not the legendary supervillains of reputation. They were Renaissance politicians who played by the rules of their time, who were particularly successful for a brief period, and who ultimately failed and fell from power like every dynasty eventually does. Their real story is instructive. The legendary story is entertaining but false. We do neither history nor ourselves any favors by preferring comfortable legends to uncomfortable truths. The Borgias deserve to be judged by their actual deeds, not by crimes invented by their enemies and perpetuated by 5 centuries of credulous repetition. In the end, perhaps the greatest irony is this. The Borgias' real crime wasn't poison, it was success. They rose too high, too fast, through too obviously corrupt means. Their enemies couldn't defeat them politically or militarily while they held power, but they could defeat them in the one arena the Borgias couldn't control, in the stories told after their fall, in the histories written by their victors, in the legends that would last longer than any temporal power. And perhaps that's the most important lesson the Borgia story teaches us. Be careful whom you defeat, because the defeated write histories too, and sometimes revenge taken through legend lasts longer than any revenge taken through poison. Thank you for joining me on this investigation into one of history's most persistent and least supported legends. I hope this examination of the Borgia poisoning accusations, separating what we can prove from what we merely believe, understanding how legends are created and why they persist, has brought both enlightenment and healthy skepticism to your evening. The story of the Borgias reminds us that history is not simply what happened, but what we choose to remember and how we choose to remember it. Sometimes the truth is less dramatic than the legend. Sometimes it's more complex than we'd like. But it's always worth pursuing, especially when it contradicts comfortable stories we've believed for centuries. Until our next journey into history's mysteries, I wish you calm reflections and peaceful rest. Good night.